All right, folks, let's get the show on the road. So day 4, we're going to start it off with Eric Hansen, Marketing Digital Archaeology, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Take it away, Eric.
So thanks, everybody. This is sort of a topic that I haven't actually talked before too much in public, so I won't necessarily be as fluent as I would like to be. So just bear with me a little bit. Hopefully the talk won't end up like this too much, but you never know. So anyway, you're a test audience, and same with you out there in internet world, that the topics I'm going to explore are, some of it is actually, it's really interesting, exciting, and talk about like things like making videos to promote your work, which is a really interesting way of communicating what we do to a broader audience. But the overall context in which we work and some of the pressures upon different programs and projects in this general space of digital archaeology, those aren't so nice. And those are actually something that we actually have to be a little bit more aware about. We need to discuss these things, and we need to try to shape public policy around the institutional supports and the institutional organization of what we do as digital archaeology in order to create a landscape where we can thrive, and where we can thrive by doing the right thing, right? So the idea is that we need to set up a policy framework where us working in this space do well by doing right. And that's not necessarily where the incentive structures lie right now, and that's a big, big problem. So overall structure of the talk, hopefully, will be just going to give you a little bit of an introduction again, because there was some questions about, what's open context, how's it different from like TDAR, other repositories, what's the sort of niche. So I just want to reintroduce that a little bit. And then I'll get a little bit more into these sort of macro issues, the structural issues about where we are situated, where other projects are situated, how we understand that, and some ways to navigate some of these challenges that are pragmatic, but also really pointing to the need for broader political advocacy to be able to change the circumstances to be better. So this is a pretty picture of kind of different paths we can take. And we, with Open Context, and lots of you all engaged in this program, this workshop, are really heavily engaged with digital data. And I'm going to make a false dichotomy in digital data, but just to illustrate kind of a point, because these sort of points of contrast are sometimes useful for, sort of making some big issues come a little bit more clear. So I really like this idea of slow data, and this is coming off of some of the work that Sean Graham has been talking about, especially blogging about, with he calls it thick data, but it's sort of like this ethnographically thick, contextually rich information. This is something that is really interesting and important. And also Bill Kerr at University of North Dakota has been talking about slow archaeology. And when you sort of bring these together, slow archaeology, the idea of being having some time for reflection, introspection, to try to understand what you're engaged with, to not just for high throughput, lots of stuff, get it going really fast, get the publication out really fast, get the data out really fast, cover the widest area possible, but also, take some time for reflection about what it is that you're doing. How is it meaningful? How can you make it more meaningful? So that's Bill Kerr's idea of slow archaeology, and when you put these things together, you get sort of slow data when we're talking about these outcomes in a digital space. So that is sort of like at one end of the spectrum. And then we have on the other end of the spectrum the kind of thing that we see emphasized over and over and over again on things like TED Talks, and in NSF calls for proposals, and in marketing materials that universities like to put out, or like Google and other analytics companies like to sort of emphasize this idea of big data, right? So big data is where the information is almost factory farmed, and that's almost literal, right? When you're engaged in social media channels when you are even engaging with a search engine like Google, all this information about you is being harvested, and it's being harvested at a huge, incredible scale. And similarly about the information that's being collected about you by intelligence agencies and whatnot. The idea around this is that with big data, we can have greater control over what we're looking at. It's the idea of having sort of big centralized masses of information. It's somehow a tool of power. And that's what gets really emphasized in a lot of the institutional settings that we're working in. And I think what's really interesting when we're coming at it from the space of the humanities, coming at it from the social sciences, especially in a place like archaeology, we're in a really interesting position where we can offer some critique and alternatives about this vision of data. Data doesn't have to be a big centralized tool of control. Data can be something that is thick. Data can be something that you can engage with more slowly and with more contextual nuance. I think I just knocked my plug out. All right, so hopefully I won't. Sorry, internet world. There we go. Now, this idea of big data versus slow data, and I talked about this a little bit last year. Some of it also relates to the institutional structures in which we work. Most of us are in institutions that are very Taylorized. Taylor being Frederick Taylor, the founder of the Harvard Business School, who came up with the idea of scientific management, the idea that by deep monitoring of people with standard objective metrics about what people are doing, the sort of outputs that they're creating, those are the kinds of things that our employers collect about us, and that they rank us and evaluate us depending on these outputs that we create that are measured in a quantified kind of a way. A lot of research data is sort of in this general kind of a world of Taylorism. And when you see things like the data management plan requirements that NSF requires, a little bit from NEH, it's often talked about in this sort of language of compliance, right? Bureaucratic compliance. You are, in order to get the grant, this is one of the hoops to jump through. You got to deposit your data someplace, or you have to come up with at least a plan about it. And that is a requirement for you in order to get funding. So what's interesting about that is that it's sort of this idea of research data is entering into archaeology and a lot of other areas of scholarship as a bureaucratic hoop to jump through, not necessarily as an area where we see a lot of where there's seen as a lot of intellectual engagement that is needed. So many of our colleagues are actually seeing this as like, oh, all right, another thing, checkbox, right, in order to get the grant. So this is something that we're trying to push back against a little bit, again, promoting that idea of slow data, thick data, and highly contextual data. And the point for us is that an excavation is not a data mine, right? So the information that we're collecting as in archaeology is not something that is really, really, really easily fungible. There are really interesting problems associated with archaeological information that are really contextually rich. We have all sorts of diverse research agendas. We have diverse research histories. We describe the world in different kinds of ways. Data creation for us is often very labor intensive. All right, so we're not generating big data sets like a lot of scientific instruments are doing. And we work in the context of a broader social world around us, right? So we had a lot of discussions about the imperative for engagement with stakeholder communities, especially indigenous communities that we're working with and hopefully developing richer collaborations with. You can't just willy-nilly treat this information as divorced from all of that and only something that matters in terms of scale and interoperability. So we have a lot of really complex issues that sort of push back against that idea of big data, and it sort of pushes back against some of the Taylor's perspectives of data, that in the sense that our data only matters if it's going to be really high impact and if it's going to be easily fungible, so we can measure each other's data outputs and rank each other based on how big your data set is and how many downloads it gets and how many times it gets reused and mashed together with other things. I mean, all those things are important, but there's a lot more to it that we have to worry about in the context of archaeology. And so that's something that we need to consider. So with us, and I introduced this last year, we have a publishing metaphor with open context. And the sense about publishing that we like to emphasize is that data can be intellectually thick, right? Contextually rich, and data deserve a focus, effort, intellectual commitment in order to enrich and in order to make intelligible. Not just for our colleagues now, but for people down in future generations. So the idea around this is to emphasize that data is more than just a residue of research that gets sort of chucked into a repository, right? So you can imagine chucking in really messy, ugly spreadsheets that people can't understand. You can preserve those, but is that going to be meaningful to anybody in the future? That's one of the big questions, and that's one of the things that we're exploring with this publishing metaphor. Really briefly, some general attributes about it. We emphasize linked data in the sense that open context is only one information system in this wide ecosystem, and we need to articulate with a variety of many other systems that are also doing some very essential work in information curation. Sometimes they're going to be in archaeology, sometimes they're going to be in other disciplines. That sort of wide articulation is really important. So we cross-reference with TDAR, but we also look outside of archaeology. So one of the main vocabularies that we reference is the Encyclopedia of Life, which maintains a database of biological taxonomies. And we can relate a lot of the zooarch and paleobotany data that we publish with a much wider world of bioinformatics. Ugh, crap. So, sure, thanks. Sorry about that. Yeah. The data we publish in open context is open data. It's mainly CC BY license, and I'm going to talk about this more later in the talk. That's not to say all data should be that way, all right? I want to emphasize that, but some data should be this way. We're working in this niche where we try to emphasize, we work in a niche where open data is a good thing, and we try to make sure that we emphasize the value and reduce the risks of that, partially with this publication metaphor. So intellectual engagement, really carefully considering what we're publishing and the context around that information, that is really essential in order to do open ethically, right? The dichotomy between open and closed is something of a false dichotomy. I'll get into that later, but we're working mainly on the open spectrum. And we're referenced by NSF and NEH for grant data management, archive the data for the long term with the California Digital Library. We are 2.5 people. We are not a long-term repository. We cannot claim to be that, but we work with repository partners, memory institutions, in our case, the University of California system, for the long-term preservation. And that's another important thing to consider is, again, in order to work in this general space, we need multiple institutional actors, we need multiple kinds of systems, and we need to leverage the strengths of these different kinds of systems in order to be able to work well and do right in this. We do mirror the information with the German Archaeological Institute, and I think I made this joke last year, and it's not as funny this year, but in case Donald Trump makes America great again, at least their data is over outside of America. And we got some recognition for this, mainly because the problems we have in archaeology are really complicated. The information problems we have are really complicated, really interesting from a broader community perspective. And this is one of the interesting impacts that digital archaeology has had, is that it's not just serving our own disciplinary community, but we're facing challenges that are faced across many other disciplinary communities. And so the approaches that we've been experimenting with data publishing have had a wide interest outside of archaeology. So we've won awards from the digital curation community about some of what we've done, especially with zooarchaeology, and also the White House recognized some of these efforts in order to produce, share open information, which was pretty neat because, you know, they're also with the Human Genome Project and all the really big science things with like multi-billion-dollar budgets, and here's us with multi-$10,000 budgets, able to share the stage with them, which is pretty cool. Anyway, again, context about all this. If you want an interesting paper that sort of describes from an outside perspective, this is a library and information scientist, Beth Sheehan, who wrote an interesting paper about open context and TDAR, just to sort of illustrate some of the differences in the different approaches. And again, these are complementary approaches. You could read her paper. She says they're complementary approaches. And I'll talk about this a little bit more. But again, the point is that there is a wider interest in these kinds of things. So the kind of work that you all are doing in this digital space can have really broad multidisciplinary sorts of impacts. Now, this is one of the reasons why we had this publishing metaphor. Sorry to do this to you so early in the morning. So we're really complicated in archaeology. So we have a range of different kinds of data, from the more structured, that's that little table icon, with like, and then that's the kind of information that you can imagine quantifying, doing statistics on, to more media-rich pictures, 3D models, and narrative text. So a lot of the information that we publish are actually in the form of field notes, right? So these are not things that you're necessarily meant to analyze with a computer, although Sean Graham has done some really cool things with text mining these things. But these are narrative accounts of people's interactions with the archaeological record. And we have this whole gamut of materials that all need to cross-reference and articulate with one another, because they're all part of the larger picture in archaeology. And that's one of the really fascinating challenges. This is not just sort of tabular data that is more common in other scientific domains. And it's also really complicated in archaeology. This is an entity diagram from a project that is archived in the Archaeology Data Service in the UK. And it's a way of describing Anglo-Saxon graves. So imagine this is for one database in a repository, and it's super complicated. If you were to download that database, you would have to try to understand this schema to all these different relationships in order to actually use that data set. And that complexity is really difficult to scale, right? If you have to do this for every single database that you encounter, it's kind of it makes a tremendous challenge in archaeological data reuse, and that's one of the issues that we're trying to explore with the publishing metaphor. One of the other things that we're also interested in with that publishing metaphor is just basic things like data cleanup, right? Going through data sets, checking identifiers, checking to make sure that numeric data is numeric, all this sort of grungy cleanup work. And lots of you have now done this in the course of your projects and have realized, wow, that's really time consuming, right? So fortunately, tools like OpenRefine we can be able to use to try to make that a little bit faster, but we spend a lot of time doing this kind of stuff. And so to give you a sense of the amount of effort that's sometimes required, we did a study that was involved a collaboration that we ended up publishing in PLOS One, where we had several different data sets. So one of the data sets that we had about 140,000 records, but it was super clean. And we were able to work with that, review it, process it, get it ready for publication within, a matter of a few hours. Another data set had was one tenth the size, about 14,000 records, but it was all numerically coded, and it had a 90-page PDF codebook to go with it. And so you had to go through that 90-page PDF codebook and say, okay, so 13 equals sheep, okay. And then using Refine to be able to take all that. And that took a huge amount of time to be able to decode. So there's a vast spectrum in the amount of effort that's involved in these things, and a lot of the data sets that we encounter were not really oriented for public dissemination, so they need that kind of effort in order to be intelligible by a wider community. So back to that. Sorry again. Really briefly, this is our general publication workflow, where it goes through several iterations of review, documentation, editing, and annotation. But once we publish the information, all of that process actually ideally should continue because people are going to encounter errors with data sets, and we need to respond to these and update these things. So data is almost a form, data has a lot of similarities with producing software, producing code, right? When you write software, you're never done. There are always going to be bugs to fix. And the same sort of tools that we use for curating software, version control especially, we can apply to structured data sets. And even with after publication, re-release, revision, that is something that we should expect and hope to be continual. So the more the data sets get engagement, the more people are going to find issues with them, the more that then we can over time also improve data quality even after it's gone through our own editorial process. So just want to highlight a little bit because some people had some questions over the past couple days about what's the difference between Open Context and say Tito or other repositories. And the general issues is, I mean, there's this, this data publishing side where we have this review process, we do cleanup and alignment of different data sets into a common database where we can have a common query interface, an API, and some people are playing with that API now. But it also allows us to do different things in terms of how one references and discovers data. So for us, we have a high level of granularity. So an individual archaeological entity or observation has its own stable web URI. That means you could point to it and link it to other data sets across the web. So that high level of granularity is a big issue for us to promote interoperability and reuse because you can point to something specifically. In other cases, if the data that we had were in the form of files, like in spreadsheets or in databases, an archaeological observation, say it's an ancient coin or a potsherd, that record of a potsherd may be in a record of 10,000 other objects, right? So how would you reference that one object when the only thing that you can actually point to and cite is a blob of data with a DOI? So that is one of that's one of the big distinctions. Now, this is not to say that what we do is better than what a normal repository does, because there are trade-offs. Our approach to doing this is more expensive and time-consuming because we have to do data cleanup, we have to do schema alignment, and running a big index of lots of different archaeological data sets that requires some hefty computing power. And we've been called an expensive boutique publisher, also in the literature. So you can Google that, it's fun. So a more standard repository is able to offer these archiving and preservation services at a much cheaper price point in some ways, with the ability for people to do sort of self-service uploading and metadata documentation of their files. So these are two different kinds of trade-offs. It is really, and this is why these things are complementary. So we're trying to focus with Open Context on the data sets that people want to have and need to have this level of granularity and this level of access. That is not going to be the case for everything. And we need to focus on areas where these efforts are targeted for bigger payoff. This kind of approach is absolutely essential because we have gobs and gobs and gobs of languishing data out there, and we really need to be able to just preserve it at least. And then maybe, hopefully in the future, we can triage and try to make sense of it later, but at least for basic preservation, this kind of thing is really important. So again, complementary kinds of approaches. I'm going to fly through this a little bit just to give a few examples of, these are different media records. These are archaeological contexts from the site of Kenan Tepe in Turkey. And this stuff gets reused. Individual pictures of things like archaeological context. This is a Chalcolithic fortification wall, gets cited and used as reinterpreted. So Federico Bucciolati did an interesting study where he compared an early Bronze Age Sargonid palace in Syria at the site of Tel Mazan with Kenan Tepe, and basically looked at a bunch of pictures in order to do that, because that's data, right? That's part of our documentation, and read field notes. And that's one of the things that we published and linked up together with contextual records and other sorts of records. And he's able to come up with these different observations, but actually point out specifically where he got those, where he got these kinds of information, which records, which specific pictures, which specific field note that provided that key information, the key documentation in order for him to come up with the comparisons that he needed. So that's something that is useful about that notion of granular access, and sometimes that's where it's valuable. Another data set that we're publishing and is with Bill Kerr, his PCAP project in Cyprus. And I want to show it as an example because this is one of the things that we're encountering a lot in archaeology. The notion that we are all sort of special snowflakes in terms of our data, right? We all describe our worlds differently. How do we do something with that? And it's a really fascinating long-term intellectual challenge, is what I want to illustrate. So Bill has a custom typological classification system that he calls chronotype that's used that he's using to describe the different survey materials, the different kinds of sherds that he's gotten in this survey. And that chronotype system is not necessarily going to be used by everybody else who does survey in the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, it's used by a couple people, but not everybody. And there's still an interest and a need to be able to relate that conceptual system of the survey material with other people's ceramic typologies. And so how do you go about doing that? And that's an interesting kind of a problem. So we're doing that with linked data and with vocabularies that are emerging now. So one would be relating it to the British Museum's thesaurus. There's also other emerging vocabularies. One interesting project is the Levantine Ceramics project that has some of the same types that are in, or analogous types or related types. They might describe it with different terminology, but a ceramicist would be able to go, oh, would be able to say, oh yes, this concept in Bill's ceramic typology has a relationship with this other concept in this other ceramic typology, and we can start networking these different typologies, these different classification systems together. It is really labor intensive. It's also really an interpretive exercise. Your assertions that this is the same as that are, that's an interpretive kind of a decision, and that's an interesting thing that we need to think about, that when people talk about we need standards in archaeology in order to do big data, right? So I used deep voices for big data. That kind of issue is, you have to remember, unpack it, that there are all sorts of interpretive assumptions behind that in order to make that happen. And that all of those things ultimately need to be contestable. And that's one of the fun things and the interesting things about doing these things with linked data is that we retain Bill's own chronotype system, his own way of describing the world. There are other ways of describing that world out there, and we can very explicitly and formally relate those concepts together. And because they're explicit and formal, then in some ways they're more contestable because, you can see exactly the type of relationship that is between one of Bill's concepts and one of the concepts in this Levantine Ceramics project. And that is also an interesting kind of thing. So when people talk about using computers and relating ontologies and things like that, yes, it's interpretive, but we've been doing this traditionally a lot in archaeology. We're just making it more explicit. And so that's a cool kind of a thing. Just because it's on a computer doesn't mean it's sort of empirical, weird, objective, and theoretically vacuous, right? We're doing stuff now with computers where interpretive decisions can be more explicit and then open for inspection and critique. And I think that that's an interesting kind of a thing. So I went through this last year, so I'm not going to do too much with it. This is a little bit easier in ZooArc. We have much richer control vocabularies for things like species and anatomical elements. So here's a bunch of ways that zooarchaeologists have described cattle in their data sets. And we all sort of, we relate all of those different concepts to the Encyclopedia of Life URI for Bos Taurus. And doing so allows us to publish papers, which is nice. And those papers can have nice arrows and charts with, you know, like archaeologists love arrows on maps, right? So we did that. That was awesome research outcome. And we could also do discovery, right, and mapping of these things. This is Bos Taurus bones in Western Asia and Europe, and this is where we were about a year and a half ago. And so that one paper came out, and then a year and a half later, now the map is starting to fill in with a lot more places that we've related to this common vocabulary. And so as you know, the picture is getting richer and deeper as time goes on and as we publish more data. And so that's one of the interesting things too, is that these vocabularies are additive. We're networking this information. And if you remember some of the ideas about networking, there's something called Metcalfe's law, where the value of a network increases sort of exponentially with the number of nodes and connections on that network. So if you have a telephone and you're the only person in the world with a telephone, your telephone is only as useful as a paperweight, right? You can't call anybody. But as soon as there are more people on the network, then you have the more potential for interactions. And that's a similar thing with data, and especially with linked data. As the landscape or the ecosystem enriches with more and more data that we can link to, the potential for interesting and valuable linkages increases also. So so some of it right now with linked data is an act of faith in the sense that linking together different vocabularies. Not a lot of archaeologists in the world, very little in the way of digital archaeology, precious little in the way of open data that we can actually link together. So this is an act of faith, but we're seeing in examples like this, you know, slowly but surely, we're actually building up more interesting sorts of scales where you can link to get data in interesting kinds of ways. So another way to think about it, it's a big bootstrapping problem, right? So we're starting out with virtually nothing, and we have to build something from scratch. And we need a lot more shared data, and we need a lot more of those vocabularies that we can use to be able to cross-reference data together. One example of that is the DINA project. And DINA is the Digital Index of North American Archaeology. It's a collaboration that we're working with Josh Wells and David G. Anderson and a lot of other colleagues. And we recently got, I need to update that, so we recently got NSF money this year and IMLS money this year to be able to expand this and also to expand the network of stakeholders that we're engaged with. So all the data that you see here, before we published anything, we contacted every single TIPO and tribal nation in this area of coverage to be able to make sure that we're engaged with something that is, you know, we want to make sure that we're not doing something that's going to be harming other people's and other people's interests. And so that first data set went up, and this was a sort of a proof of concept of it. Next stage of this, we're trying to expand further west in the United States. But before we actually do anything, and we do take no for an answer, we have to make sure that we're working with the communities involved so that we're not going to be misrepresenting their heritage. And one of the big challenges then for us is governance. How do we set up structures in which people have meaningful control over this information, represented as a tribal nations have meaningful control over this information, how it's presented, how it's going to be used, and also recognizing that this information is, we don't have a lot of control over how it's created, right? So this is coming out of state agencies, government agencies, and there's going to be really interesting discussions about this. So the big challenges with DINA aren't necessarily like big data sort of technical issues. The big challenges are really the community and the governance issues. And those are one of the things that we're really grateful for IMLS funding to be able to really tackle and try to explore in a lot of depth. But one of the values of DINA is not just a big data set in terms of seeing human settlement in North America, but it is to create one of these vocabularies to cross-reference information about North American archaeology. So there are going to be sites that are going to be discussed in publications. There are going to be sites that are going to be discussed in reports. Those types of identifiers in those sites we can use we can text bind, relate to the data set as linked data, and then show associations with how these reports are actually relate to the spatial landscape. So you can imagine mapping out the distribution of publications in North American archaeology. You know, where is the geographic focus? Where are the chronological foci? And also relating this body of published literature also with what's in repositories like TDAR, and also imagine linking these things with information that might be curated by different museums. So that's one of the goals with that. And we're working with the Phoebe Hearst Museum at UC Berkeley as a museum partner to be able to cross-reference all of these different sources of information so that you get a more holistic picture of where that information is actually curated. So, really briefly, with open context right now, I was talking about all these vocabularies for cross-referencing information, and these are the vocabularies that we're using currently. And it looks like a lot, but it's not nearly sufficient for most researcher needs, because a lot of your interests in archaeology are very specific in time and place, and those vocabularies just don't exist yet. And this is where, sort of moving into the second phase of this talk, we're talking about more this sort of broader context. We need much deeper and wider engagement in the archaeological community and actually developing those vocabularies, critiquing and discussing and debating those vocabularies. And this ultimately needs to be one of the, needs to be incorporated in archaeological publishing in a meaningful way so that these vocabularies are useful. People publish typologies and people publish periodization schemes all the time, but it's in PDF literature, right? And you can't reuse that. You can't use that computationally. We need to be able to publish those key kinds of scaffolding to relate information together in ways that are usable in a computational sense. And one of the projects that's doing that is called Period O, and we mentioned this last year. It's led by Adam Rabinowitz and Ryan Shaw, and they also, originally thanks to NEH funding, and now with IMLS funding. And so the idea around Period O is to have the scholarly community publish periodization schemes for different regions, discuss and debate those things, and then we can reference them as linked data. And so that means that you don't necessarily have to, everybody doesn't have to agree on one periodization scheme, but again, by publishing these as a formally and explicitly modeled concepts, then I can choose a periodization scheme that suits my needs, my interpretive interests, and my research goals, and I can point to that, and I can be very explicit about about the periodization that I'm talking about. So one example of this is that my background is in Near Eastern archaeology, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, there's an Iron Age, but there's not one Iron Age. There are actually three Iron Ages. There's the Iron Age in the high, medium, and high, middle, and low chronologies. And the high, middle, and low chronologies have a lot of discussion and debate about them. Some of it very rancorous, because they're archaeologists, right? People love fighting over things like that. But these matter for interpretation. Your choices of those different chronological schemes matter for how you think the development of like the biblical state of Israel happened, how it relates to things like the collapse of the New Kingdom Egyptian Empire, all sorts of different kinds of really important issues. So you need to be able to reference these chronological concepts very explicitly. And that's a really interesting kind of project that's starting to move into this direction of publishing these concepts and typologies and periodizations that we need to be able to relate data together, but doing it in a really interesting and theoretically appropriate kind of way. Briefly, another example of this is Kate Brunson and colleagues, who's working on oracle bones in East Asia. And she's interested in coming up with a systemized way of describing the sort of evolution of oracle bones, which are the where we see some of the earliest writing in East Asia. And in order to do that, she's needing to publish her descriptive system, the systems that she's using to code and describe where these bones get modified. And these are interesting published artifacts too. So what's cool about this is that it's not just data that we're publishing, but we're considering the descriptive frameworks and attributes and recording systems people are creating to describe their data. Those are interesting publication outcomes also, and they should be reusable and referenceable in other people's data sets. In doing so, hopefully from a bottom-up perspective, we can start building the necessary vocabularies that in order to be able to cross-reference and hopefully see a bigger picture. So that is a subject of some current NEH funding from the Preservation and Access division at NEH. So back to this. These are all really long-term goals. This is really hard stuff, and we need decades of thoughtful effort in order to be able to do it. And we need a huge community of engagement, engaged community to be able to do it. Building up these vocabularies, publishing them, discussing them, debating them, making them theoretically appropriate. All of that requires a lot of work and a lot of deep thought, making sure that the data, coming up with protocols and processes to publish open data, or closed data, whatever, but to understand and navigate the complex ethical issues around that, all of that requires a huge intellectual commitment also. We need wide engagement around all these issues. And that's where this challenges between the slow, contextual, thick data and factory farm big data is such a big issue, right? This is one of the fundamental challenges that we're facing, because this is what gets emphasized in funding, this is what gets emphasized in universities, this is what gets emphasized in the corporate setting, where this is the glamorous stuff, the big data, right? This is where you're going to get the TED Talks. This is really hard to be able to push back against, to say, no, we need to take things slow, contextualize and nuance, because we're working, the information that we're dealing with is very complex in all sorts of different kinds of dimensions. And back to Taylor, and we're working in university contexts where things like quantification matter more in context, right? So your publication outputs are measured with metrics for the most part in most settings that you may work in. We have pressures from other kinds of directions too, like how many hits are you getting on your website? What's the level of viewer engagement? We're trying to measure all of these different things, and those measurements can be really valuable tools, but without situating those measurements in an appropriate kind of context, which is the really interesting challenge, those measurements can take on a life of their own and become really tools of power that can distort what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that that's one of the big issues. One of the fascinating debates now in scholarly communications is about things like metrics and altmetrics. So metrics are things, conventional metrics are things like the impact factor of the journal that you publish in and the number of publications that you create. Altmetrics is this interesting sort of pushback against that, to sort of say, well, look, there are lots of different ways in which scholarly communications can be evaluated and consumed. It can have much wider, more impacts in all sorts of different directions than we can actually get with citation and impact factor kinds of measurements. What's interesting about that is, that's great. It's really good because we're getting discussion, debate about it. But one of the concerns that you might have is that, are we just expanding the scope of Taylorism so that every tweet that you have and your sort of the number of followers that you have on Twitter, is that something that your dean is going to be tracking? Like, I see that you got unfollowed 3 times this week. So this is a big kind of a concern, right? So yes, we need to, this discussion, debate is really interesting and it's really important, but we also have to consider that even alt metrics are going to be going into systems of power relationships which are not necessarily all that nice. So context is going to be measured around that, and we want to make sure that our systems of alt metrics aren't tools of surveillance to be used against us. And this is one of my favorite Dilberts about the whole thing. So, on that note, so really interesting discussion of some of these bigger meta issues, and this is a sort of general social kind of a problem. I really urge you to read Kathy O'Neill. She has a great blog that explores a lot of the sort of uses of quantification, uses of algorithms, and the social context around all of that. And she has a recent blog post, is Trump a poorly trained machine learning algorithm? So anyway, but the point being is that there is this sort of false sense of empiricism and objectivity in the metrics that we collect, that are collected about us, and these are used as political tools. And we need more people like her to be able to push back against us and to say, well, actually, these numbers come from a context. There are all these different sampling biases. The numbers are weighted in certain sorts of ways that are implicit and maybe in an algorithm, and that's going to lead to certain kinds of conclusions that are going to be potentially reinforcing a status quo of certain political arrangements. So this is a picture of looting in Iraq and following the US invasion. And I just sort of show that to be my depressing slide of sustainability. So that's one of the big issues around this. So, talking about, with open context, all this need for wider and community engagement, the need to take things slow, the need to contextualize information, the need to have broad participation in this whole effort, all of that is slow, time-consuming, and requires funding, ultimately. And, where's that going to come from? And here we're working in the space of digital archaeology, where this really interesting, intellectually challenging and fascinating and really cool area of research is emerging precisely at a time when public funding and orientations of universities, institutions for higher learning, are sort of almost feel like they're abandoning the concept of public goods, right? And that's one of the really hard parts about all this. And a lot of this challenge is that we're now working on these projects and programs, and we're sort of promoting ourselves as kind of semi-commercial branded services. So here's a postcard for Open Context, says what we do, and hey, we had a price list on the back, right? So and that's weird in the context of scholarship, right? So we're directly trying to sell our research outcomes. So imagine how much progress or how weird it would be back in the day when we're looking at the origins of agriculture, the origins of the state, and every one of our research programs in that general area had to have a financial model that returned a profit in order to sustain the work, right? That it's a weird kind of a world that we're working in scholarship, where we have to try to have a revenue stream in it that is self-funding in a lot of ways, because we don't have outside supports, and that's really difficult. What's also challenging in that is that we have expectations, and we have pressures for being self-funding, creates this interesting landscape of incentives which are not necessarily all that great. And so those incentives could be to maybe cut corners ethically, or to try to monetize the services that we're creating, but downplay negative externalities. And I wrote a recent paper that is on GitHub. So this is the most heavily peer-reviewed thing I've ever written. And it was just, it's on GitHub, on version control. It's sort of exploring these issues. And these are really genuinely hard kinds of problems. And what it comes down to is if you're working in something like open data and you're producing information that is open, meaning that there are no licensing restrictions about it, there's technical interoperability, you can get the data out, all of these sorts of issues, you're creating public goods. economists typically say there are no market mechanisms to create public goods. That's why we have the state subsidies for things like freeways or state subsidies for defense or whatever. That there are a lot of these sort of services that market mechanisms typically fail to do and fail to create. So working in this general space of, say, open data means we have a really difficult problem in financing public goods. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to consider a little bit, in the sort of world of discussion and debate around open access has really highlighted some of these issues. That world of open access debates has also highlighted some of the sort of bigger macro challenges. So this is the sort of rate of general inflation. This is the rate of publication costs increases. So you can see that there's a bit of a disconnect, right? So we're paying a lot more money over time for academic communications, and that's been shown over and over and over again. At the same time, here's a nice graph of student debt, now over like $1.3 trillion. So so this is where the money's going, right? So this is all the money for that's really available for us is increasingly being concentrated into hands that we don't have access to. And then here's a nice little graph of jobs in academia. So where non-tenure track kinds of sort of adjunct kinds of positions are where the big growth has been over the past several years. Hard to sustain engagement, intellectual engagement with difficult sorts of issues in the context of a hire and fire sort of a situation. And Sean was discussing about failing, right? And the context of failure is that, well, it's great to be able to embrace failure as this wonderful thing that, yes, we got to be bold, fail, but, only if you have tenure. So, and that's an increasingly unrealistic kind of expectation for people. I'm going to skip that one. So another really interesting, important person to look at for everybody is the writings of Bethany Novinsky, who's been exploring a lot of these different kinds of issues about the alt academy, adjunctum, and how it relates specifically with the digital humanities, in addition to a whole bunch of other really interesting issues that she's explored. But I would just want to highlight a couple of people that are really have gone to great lengths to explore these issues in a very articulate and really interesting manner. So, getting back into the zone of where I was going with this talk, this is Evgeny Morozov. He's a famous internet curmudgeon. In fact, he hates the term internet. And he proposed this idea of solutionism as one of the sort of big points of failure in terms of intellectual failure around the way that technology is being discussed in our larger society. And the idea around solutionism is that there's a simple, easy technical solution for wildly complicated, intractable problems. And so if you have a complex, hard problem, there's an app for that. Boom, fixed, right? All we need is some Google engineering, and then we can solve problems of colonialism, right? The legacy of colonialism to be fixed with an app or something like that. That is the kind of thing that is in the sort of cultural landscape of tech, and it's part of the cultural landscape of tech that we work in, also in digital humanities. So it's very tempting, right? So cheap, hip, easy to market kinds of things, and it goes with this sort of general neoliberal kind of perspective that the problems don't require really long-term engagement. They require the creation of a well-marketed app. And that's where some of these issues of branding, I think, are fascinating in the general space. And again, if you want to get a little bit more into it, take a look at that paper that I wrote. But yeah, so we have stickers, right? And we work in a competitive granting environment. We have to sell our solutions, meaning that we have to talk about what we're doing is unique, interesting, and different. And sometimes that means that we will ignore what other people have to say. And that's a really hard thing. So how many times do you go into a situation like this where it's a very, you have a lot of self-promotion of your own work. And there's a strong incentive to do that because nobody else is going to sell your work. You're the one having to do that, and you're in a really competitive situation. And that's really icky, and we need to be cognizant of that, all right? So when I'm giving you stickers, remember, we're not the only people with stickers out there doing really interesting things, all right? And there's a real reason for that because, I got to eat too. So anyway, so lots of stickers, lots of different programs. A lot of these are really semi-commercial services that are trying to sell you services and have contracts maybe to do some scanning, to do, set up a repository, to do community engagement. A lot of these sorts of issues are in there, and these are all important. We need all of these things. This landscape is essential, and we need to have this diversity. We need to have a multiplicity. We need more than just these things. The problem is, who's going to pay for it all? How are we going to sustain that? And that's one of the things that I find one of the biggest challenges with that. So I'm going to have a little commercial interlude now, just talking about, because I promised that some of this will actually be pragmatic. But when I'm showing you the video that we've got, remember that larger macro issue and the sort of general critique that we need to articulate about these things is an important element. It's not just sort of raw digital archaeology we're just one big happy family. We're trying to be, but there's so many different kinds of things that are working against it, which want to do things like promote monopolies, to promote some sort of privileging of one system over another for certain kinds of application areas. And what we really should do, and open context is, I think it's cool, but it is not the end all and being all of everything. If we're successful with open context, somebody is going to come along and build something better, right? Our success should be determined by if we can get this stuff moving into an interesting direction where the data, the theoretical issues, the methodological issues that we're exploring, if people build upon that and do something better, that would be really cool. The problem is, I still want to eat, right? And so how do we do both of those things? How do we create a situation where, if we're successful in doing right, then we're not thrown out and discarded as into the world of unemployment. So that is a fundamental problem. Now, so that's sort of like the sad stuff. I'll show you something sort of happy. So, gratuitous self-promotion coming up. So this is a little informational video that we created. I'll talk about a little bit about how we did that. But
serving and sharing archaeology research data helps us to better understand heritage worldwide. But today's conventional archiving and publishing norms undervalue this research data, making it inaccessible and often promoting bureaucratic checkbox compliance. Shouldn't there be a better way? There is. We think data represents a new frontier in research and needs to be preserved, communicated, and appreciated. So, we created Open Context, a web-based open access publishing service that invests in both data quality and linking to a broader world of scientific information, all contributing to deeper understanding. At Open Context, we work with researchers to clean and organize their data and related media. We then broadly publish and archive the data, linking to partners across the globe, creating a wider world of knowledge. Free, open source knowledge that anyone can then access and build upon, be it for research, teaching, computation, or even creativity. Open Context, because data are for discovery and inspiration.
And then here's the pitch. Yeah. So now again, so general context of like, all right, we're working in this competitive situation. So what we're trying to do is broaden the base of funding that we can actually work for. So we're trying to raise more money from donors, from the philanthropic sector. And so one of the reasons for building these sort of videos, and I'll show you another video after we turn off the live feed because it's not quite ready for prime time yet, is that archaeological data management is a really esoteric, weird thing that donors don't necessarily grok really easily. So, and even the archaeological community has a hard time understanding this. This one is sort of more oriented toward a professional community in some ways about what we do with data publishing and all that. But communication and sharing really complex, esoteric, niche sorts of programs like, something like Open Context is a huge, tremendous challenge. And I think what was really interesting for us was the process around this. So we worked with a company called Engage Digital Media. So this is a for-profit company. And what was really special about that was that a really interesting process by which they try to understand us, the context in which we work. So we had this really long they had this really long, essentially a form of describe your organization and your background and, the environment around you and your general sort of goals, the sort of, and it was almost, it was this wonderful opportunity for interesting introspection, like, who are we? Why are we doing this? Why do I code until 2 a.m. sometimes? And that is and that was really useful because it communicated with them, some key aspects of what we're trying to accomplish, and then they're able to pass that on to a team of writers, and then we got different kinds of stories back about like, okay, so for a minute video, these are the kinds of things that you can happen, these are the kinds of messages that you can emphasize. And then we select through that. There's some iterations. So we're proving the stories that there's no dinosaurs in this, right? And then we move on to the production phases in archaeology of actually making the video. And so this character here, he was flashing right by. This sort of hapless guy that was in the warehouse with the bones. The original version of him looked like, my apologies to Serbian war criminals, but he looked like a Serbian war criminal. He had this sort of widow's peak, and he just he was this sort of gray, horrible guy. Dracula. Yeah. So it was a. To try to come up with different kinds of the animation styles, the tempo of the music. These type of things required huge amounts of iteration. And that was one of the things that was a really interesting challenge about producing a video. So if you're going to be doing this kind of thing, you are going to be investing a tremendous amount of time, but also thought in trying to distill what you are doing into something that can fit into a minute. Because honestly, most people don't have more than a minute to engage with an online video. What's cool about that now about this video is that something like it's gotten like 600 or something unique views around the world. That's really neat because the biggest audiences I usually engage with for talks are about as big as you, right? And so we're reaching a much broader audience in some ways about this kind of a message. And that's sort of the distillation of what we're trying to accomplish with Open Context. So I'm going to quit there since I'm just at my time now. And I'll show you another video offline, but maybe we do some questions first, or okay. So, all right. So, thanks.
Questions?
Yeah.
You had a slide up for impact stories.
Yeah.
But could you just talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So let me.
Sure. He had a slide up on impact story.
Right. So impact story is it's a really interesting. It's a not-for-profit organization. It's funded NSF and Sloan mainly, and what they're trying to do is harvest metrics from multiple different sources. So, say Twitter, Facebook, from social media, Mendeley. There are some publishers that are collecting different metrics also. So PLOS collects metrics on the views and downloads on individual articles. And so what they're trying to do is to come up with a more comprehensive and realistic summation of the overall impact of somebody's scholarly output. And you could apply this on data sets, you could apply this on different sorts of publications, you could apply this on slides that you share, like with SlideShare or something like that. So long as it has a stable identifier, they can start grabbing metrics associated with it in different places. They're trying to be smart about that in terms of collecting metrics in different sorts of dimensions, right? That, okay, this is sort of like a social impact, these are sort of citation impacts and that type of thing. And one of their goals is if we're only rewarding publication in terms of conventional papers, then we're going to under-reward things like data or code contributions of data or code, which are also now key outputs of scholarship. So the thinking is that in order to value something, we have to measure something. And I think it's an interesting discussion that really were very instrumental in sort of blowing open this idea that that they're in contesting conventional metrics. One of the sort of more meta issues, though, is that in contesting more conventional metrics, are we just replacing one set of metrics with another set of metrics, which will be a little bit more pervasive and more intrusive in some ways, right? And so that's a bigger meta question, and that's not something that they can solve. That's a bigger power issue. That's how we structure our institutions. So that's broad-based university policies and that type of thing. That's the whole social and cultural norms of how we measure and evaluate scholarship. That is a big problem. So but this is an interesting kind of foray into that space. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think one of the things that keeps coming back to me is, and I appreciate this notion of the kind of slow archaeology and thick data and so on, but where the change really needs to happen is through training. And so the kind of curriculum implications of what you're describing here, and in terms of pedagogy, thinking about the ways in which we build this into undergraduate, graduate coursework. So it's more an observation. It's certainly something we're thinking about in our department and beginning to struggle with. And, so I think some sessions at SAA around, again, how do we approach this through our curriculum and pedagogy would be very valuable.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. I mean, one of the important points is to get beyond the sort of gee whiz of the tech, right? And to realize that the gee whiz of the tech, that sort of thing, the sort of flashy but shallow, or flashy but decontextualized, is part of the problem, and it involves a set of fascinating issues also that, as social scientists or as humanists, we have actually a lot of the conceptual tools and that we can probe and explore in really interesting kinds of ways. So I think that the engagement with it is critical, but also the sort of critical engagement with it is critical. And I think that's, those are some of the really interesting points. More broadly, though, we still have to worry about that general context of, well, what are these people going to do? How are they going to make a living? Are they going to go into an academic community where none of this actually matters that much? Still. Are they going to be, or are they going to go into a track where, yes, we have DH centers and stuff like that, but they're mainly full of adjuncts, or short-term people that have a year-long contract, right? That's a kind of an issue, and how do we explain these types of issues also to government offices, right? Where budgets are really tight. There's a pervasive sense of like measurement and accountability, but in a very narrow kind of a sense that the contextual nuance of metrics and web downloads and access issues and all those sorts of things. Those are hard issues to communicate, but we need exactly what you're saying, because the people that we're training now are going to be going into government offices, and the more that they have that sort of apparatus of understanding this context about these things and can critique these things, then we're going to have better governance around this stuff too. So, but I think that ultimately, we need much more fundamental reforms in the academic sector. If any of this stuff is going to be sustainable, it can't be a zero-sum game. It can't be the Hunger Games. You're not going to have very ethical behavior. You're not going to have collaboration in a meaningful sort of a way for the long term if we all have to sort of kill each other. And that's a big issue. And one of the things that we're also trying to do, we can't just make money up here, but there are traditional sources in the academy that sustain long-term engagement with information. So there's the library and the museum community, which I think is fundamental in doing this better. So rather than having organizations like ours that are trying to sort of work in this general space, something like our kind of program needs to be in the context of a memory institution like libraries, where we can have a longer term way to engage with this stuff. These are the memory institutions in our society. That's what they're dedicated to be able to do. Unfortunately, lots of library budgets are basically appropriated by Elsevier. I showed you that graph of all the money going into those sorts of places. We need to recapture some of that money in order to sustain this kind of work, and then we can. I think we could do this sort of thing in a manner that is more sustainable, and doesn't try to gloss over a lot of the deep complexities that we have to engage with in sort of solutionist kind of branding. Anybody else? Yeah, John.
Eric, if you're interested, Bill Carhart says he'd love to do a session on slow data, slow archaeology. He's all in, he's ready.
All right. Could you tell Bill that I'll give him his proofs back? I'm slow. So the beauty about promoting slow data and slow archaeology,
There's a backside to that.
slow copy editing, right?
That's the slow editing movement.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think this is just a comment, but I think some of the tension that we see with archaeology, some of the tension that we see with getting funding to do this kind of taxonomy, definition, thick description with cataloging data is with still the standard that the field work, the archaeology, going and digging is the real work, and then when we get back in the lab, that's the housework. I mean, it's a very gendered thing still. I think.
Yeah.
I know it is in my lab, and so I see it in NEH grants, I see it in NSF still, and I think there needs to be an overhaul in the way that they write their proposals, and that's where I see the barriers. Like, there's not that funding structure for me to really dive into some of the data that I've collected for years and years and years and explore how other people are cataloging it and what are their vocabularies and how can we make them mesh. For example, I've been reading these site reports related to Chinese and Japanese immigrants in the West, and people are still using the term in 2016 Oriental to describe a very diverse group of people, and so I feel like there's this barrier still, and I'm not sure where to start other than using my own time that I should be using to publish or start another field school to get this kind of data out there and discussions happening. So I appreciate what you said, because I kept nodding this like this is my frustration, daily frustration here. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, fortunately, more people like you are getting tenure or going through that process, and will be in better positions to be able to change these things. I think that, so, you can bide your time until you can now get them. But that's a really interesting issue. You mentioned about the gendered issues. Mm-hmm. I think this is also a really interesting case also with the sort of precarity around digital archaeology and digital humanities. really the people that are going to be engaging in it are going to be disproportionately upper middle class white men, and because you know it's a risky kind of a thing, and that is, if we want to have more diversity of perspectives, and we need that, if more critique, more understanding of the role of gender in this, you know, more diversity in backgrounds, you know, in terms of ethnicity and income backgrounds, then, you know, this was an interesting point of discussion I think we had over the past year, also with labor issues, you know, the issues of things like unpaid internships. But it is a broader issue than unpaid internships too. So that if we want to attract more people into this world that have a different set of backgrounds and expectations, then we have to make sure that those people can eat, because you know they're facing structural disadvantages that I don't face, right? And I think this still sucks. So.
I think that's a good point for us to close. So let's thank Eric again.
Thank you guys too.
So I started last year my talk by reminding everyone, which I'm going to do again, that I am not an archaeologist. I come to you from literary studies and will see where the connections lie in what I'm doing. A part of this project is really attempting to open up our thinking about what the humanities is and how it can function across fields, so hopefully this will be of use. What I'm going to present today is in part a totally self-serving project pitch, so I hope you'll bear with that part, but it's also in part an argument for shifting some of our values and thinking about our practices in scholarly communication. This is not an argument for open access per se, or for the value of making more of your work available openly online, though I have lots and lots to say on that subject should you want to hear it. But instead, what I'm really wanting to focus on today is an argument for thoughtful, responsible decision making in how and where you make your work available online. And so overall, I really am hoping to get at the thing that Eric referred to at the beginning of his talk as doing well by doing right. All right, so let's begin with that. As we noted yesterday, many scholars have found it possible to create much greater impact for their work by sharing it via a range of scholarly networks online. But rather than focus on that impact, I want to start today with the May 2016 purchase of the Social Science Research Network by the Dutch publishing mega company Elsevier. This purchase, needless to say, set off a firestorm among researchers and others who are interested in open access scholarly communication, who worried about what would become of the network and its data, and not without reason. The acquisition of such a well-established research sharing network by a major commercial publisher not only presented the possibility that the company would seek to close down access to the network's store of research papers, or that it would mine them for other forms of saleable data, but also alongside their prior acquisition of Mendeley, seemed to indicate that Elsevier was seeking to vertically integrate the entirety of the research workflow. The publisher, unsurprisingly, argued that this kind of integration in which you have all of your research data and all of your drafts and preprints and all of your publications and all of the things that come out of those publications all within one tightly controlled environment, this would bring benefits to authors, right? Enabling you to move fluidly from research to drafting to journal submission. But many researchers expressed concern about what such all-encompassing lock-in might do to their community, and not least to the values that that community espoused. This concern was borne out 2 months later when SSRN users began reporting that shared materials perceived not to be in compliance with a newly imposed copyright transfer policy were being removed from the network. The Authors Alliance responded by asking whether it might be time for authors to leave SSRN. And other groups, including the Association of Research Libraries, picked up this charge, suggesting that there might be some emerging alternatives that folks who were really working in the SSRN space should consider. Now, this is only the most recent call among researchers to abandon the apparently free and open networks on which they've come to rely. Earlier in 2016, the Twitter hashtag #DeleteAcademiaEDU called upon scholars to close down their accounts on the popular scholarly social network in response to the network's suggestion that it might charge scholars for recommendations. A move that felt to many of those scholars like a type of academic payola. In each of these cases, many researchers were prompted to seek alternatives to their accustomed community spaces when the specter of monetization appeared, revealing a discomfort with the intrusion of commercial enterprises into academic workflows. As Paolo Mangiafico has pointed out, however, this focus on the role that capitalism should or shouldn't play in scholarly communication runs the risk of obscuring a larger, more important point, right? It's not just about financial transfer from one entity to another. That companies that are providing the platforms that support these research communities at root did not share the values of those research communities. And it might be a fruitful moment, Paulo suggested, for scholars to consider switching over to services that are provided by organizations whose interests map more closely to scholars' own. And only through such value alignment, he suggested, can scholars and their institutions become reasonably confident that the platforms that are supporting their research communities will develop and evolve appropriately with them. Now, this is to say that these crises of conscience that have visited online research communities have at long last highlighted for the scholarly communication landscape a situation that's been visible in other sectors of social media for a while. I mean, when it comes to networks, openness is a virtue, but other determinants may matter as much or more. Put another way, there is open, and then there is open. Right? And while the difference may seem semantic, it's anything but. SSRN and academia.edu have long been open in the sense that any interested user can create a free account, connect with other users, share work, and so forth. But neither service has been open in the deeper sense of providing member understanding of and input into their business and sustainability models. Neither is focused on interoperability with other systems in the research infrastructure or in sharing research data with other entities, except as it might provide a source of revenue. Neither is in any deep sense in dialogue with or connected to the research community. And these services may permit any scholar to contribute their work to the platform, but the scholars themselves have precious little control over the disposition of that work or the disposition of the platform on which they rely. Now, boiling this situation down to if you're not paying, you're the product being sold, gets at something crucial for scholars to consider, right? It's an important caveat emptor about the business models that we inadvertently support and their potential ramifications for our continuing research workflows. But I also want to say that this is a vast oversimplification. Well, Eric is right in saying that we don't have good, solid financial models for producing public goods. There have nonetheless been more possible options available for research services than user pays or user gets data mined and sold to advertisers. Perhaps the most the community. Humanities Commons is our effort, first and foremost, to leverage the collectives that are represented by scholarly societies on behalf of the common good. So a bit of background. For those of you who may not be familiar with the MLA, where I work, we are the largest scholarly society in the humanities. And if you pull out the professional societies like American Psychological, we're actually the largest scholarly society, period. We represent more than 25,000 members across North America and around the world, and our members teach and study a very wide range of languages, literatures, and cultures. And we launched a social network called MLA Commons in 2013 to provide those members with a platform for communication and collaboration, right? Both in order to be able to extend year-round the kinds of conversations that take place at our annual meeting, but also to provide means for members to share their scholarly work with one another. Within about 30 seconds of us launching the platform, however, we began to hear from our members about their desire to connect with colleagues in other areas of the humanities. Our members work in increasingly interdisciplinary ways, and so we started looking for ways to support those connections across fields. Now, I'm going to dig into some of the technology here for a few minutes, after which I'm going to turn back to the kinds of work and connections that we hope that these systems that we're building will make possible. Now, MLA Commons is built on the Commons in a Box platform, which is the same platform that the Digital Archaeology Commons uses. Excuse me. CBOX is a project of the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And it is in turn built on WordPress and BuddyPress, right, which provide open source solutions for organizations that are seeking rich social networking and publishing capabilities. So we have a profound interest all the way down in committing to the open source community and to really thinking about ways that what we develop can help improve Commons in a Box, and what Commons in a Box develops can help improve BuddyPress and WordPress both. So there's lots of upstream commitment that's going on in the part of our work. Now, as part of our development process for MLA Commons, with the support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, we built a plugin for CBOX that authenticates users against our member database, right? So they log in, they use our member database to ensure that they've got the correct privileges, and it provides the database information about the spaces on the network to which they are entitled to have access. MLA Commons supports a wide range of kinds of member interactions, including public group discussions that members can freely join, private group discussions, some of which members can request access to join, and others of which are restricted based on member authorization. So for instance, the members of a committee in particular only have access to that group. Members can also contribute to or create a wide variety of web-based publications on the platform, and they can participate in collaborative document authoring and a whole lot more stuff. Members can create extended CV-like profiles that link to their work on the Commons, their academic interests, the groups to which they belong, the work that they do within the network, and then anything else across the web that they want to link to. And perhaps most significantly for the network, members can also deposit their work. And when I say work, I mean preprints, data sets, presentations, syllabi, lecture notes, whatever. They can deposit this work to Core, which is the repository that we've integrated into the Commons, and they can share that work with the Commons groups to which they belong. So we built the repository in collaboration with the Center for Digital Research and Scholarship at the Columbia University Libraries. And the stack that's running the repository portion of the network is a Fedora Solar-based repository. It's a standard library grade repository. With the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, we built a WordPress plugin that provides the user interface to that Fedora Solar stack. So the users log in to the Commons and they use that interface of the Commons with which they're familiar to deposit, to enter metadata, to discover, to share work that they find within the repository. And for me, what is most significant about CORE is this fusion of a library quality repository, right, which adheres to commonly accepted metadata standards, that employs digital object identifiers, and all of the good things that come along with that. The merger of that with a social network, meaning that not only is stuff being put into the repository, and not only can that stuff then be found there if you know to go look for it, but it's also being actively used because it's being shared within this community. Members can deposit their work and share it directly with the groups to which they belong on the Commons, and those groups receive notifications that stuff has gone into the repository that they might be interested in. And so, like I said, we're seeing a really good bit of access, which is great. Even more, we just last week received a follow-on grant from the NEH, which will enable us in the next phase of course development to work with a group of libraries to make CORE interoperable with a range of other scholarly data services. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But in the meantime, we've also been investigating ways of expanding the Commons to create those interdisciplinary linkages that I was talking about that our members have been asking for. So with further support from the Mellon Foundation, we first undertook a planning process and are now deep into a pilot project that's designed to connect multiple proprietary Commons instances, each of which serve the membership of a scholarly society. So our partners in this pilot are the Association for Jewish Studies, the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and the College Art Association. The desire to connect these independent organizations and their potentially overlapping memberships, however, presented us with several immediate complications when we started looking at it. I mean, first off, there are users who are members of more than one participating organization. I mean, at this pilot stage, there may not be a whole lot of them, but as more organizations join this federation, we expect that number to grow quite significantly. And those users, like everybody else, frustrated by the proliferating accounts we maintain on the internet these days, are not going to want to maintain multiple profiles for each of the groups to which they belong. So we have to provide them some way to access any of the sites to which they're entitled with a single sign-on, as well as the ability to update their profile information once and have it reflect throughout the network. At the same time, the participating organizations need to be able to ensure controlled access to their portions of the network so that that access becomes for them a key membership benefit. You know, you join our society, you can participate in our conversations. So we needed not only a federated authentication and identity management system, but one that could ensure that the members of multiple organizations who may have their attributes represented differently by those different organizations would be accurately associated, right? So that we know that John Smith, who is a professor of Spanish literature at Columbia University, is the same person as J.H. Smith at gmail.com, who is the same person who is a member of LASA, who is the, right, so that we have an association of all of these, that publications by J.H. Smith are that same John Smith, while we also know at the same time that J.H. Smith, who teaches at Johns Hopkins, is not that person, but is the same J.H. Smith, who is a member of the Association of Jewish Studies, right? So attempting to, at the same time, we're able to link accounts that may be represented differently in different databases. We also need to be able to disambiguate similar accounts that have similar attributes. Moreover, each of the participating organizations, both the ones that we're working with right now and the ones that we expect to work with in the next phase, each of them has a different internal structure, right, with different membership categories and different membership expiration models, different governance structures, different subfield units, and so forth. And each of those different structures affects user access to particular areas of the site. And of course, you know, in the background of all of this, we needed a system that users could actually use, that wouldn't overwhelm them with the complexity that we were seeing, but that would work with the systems and credentials that they already know. So this was the moment when I totally went down the identity management rabbit hole. And I'm going to take you there for just a minute, but I promise to let you right back out. I talked with a friend who works in the library technology world, and, bought him a drink and said, I've got this question, I need to pick your brain. What's the best system for us to use when we start thinking about how we're going to link and disambiguate and, allow all of this stuff to happen? I mean, right, there's a system that can do this, right? Something like Shibboleth or, something like that, right? It could handle it. And he stared at me for a minute and said we were going to need another drink. And I do not think that my brain has been the same since. So what it turned out that we needed was not one system, but at least 5. And we needed a contractor who specialized in authentication and authorization to sort this mess out with us. So we wound up contracting with the Spherical Cow Group, who are fabulous if you ever need work done in this area, to help us create a working specification for the systems that we need. They proposed a suite of tools that would include an identity registry, which serves as the core system that manages identity data from multiple sources and creates the unique identifier that links to each individual user. We needed a matching service, which is the thing that determines if a given identity is already known. You have logged in the past with your MLA login, and now you are using your Gmail account, and this figures out that that is the same person. We needed a group registry that's used to manage authorizations or entitlements, right? Like, what groups do you belong to? Are you on this committee? When does your term expire? Are you the chair of that committee, and therefore you need to be the admin of this group, and so forth? We needed an authentication service at its most basic level, right? The thing that provides the single sign-on in the first place. And we needed a provisioning service, which is used to synchronize the identity data across the various service providers that we're working with. So in proposing solutions to meet these requirements, we worked with an order of preferences that privileged open source over proprietary solutions. Again, this is part of the ethic that we very strongly believe in being able to build on existing tools and give the work that we do back to the community. And so we privileged open source over proprietary solutions. We also privileged existing solutions over solutions that required significant development or entirely new builds, and I hope the reasoning behind that is pretty self-evident. Anyway, the result is a slightly complex system of primarily Internet-to-based products, and including co-manage, grouper, LDAP, and Shibboleth. However, to keep given the desire that I had expressed a little while ago, to keep the user experience as simple as possible in contrast to our own experience, we're also making use of various social identity providers such as Google, and we've also just become a member of the In Common Federation, and I'll talk a little bit in a second about what that means. What this means on the user side is that members will be able to log in using their Google or Twitter or what have you, whatever social credentials we give them access to log in through, if they so choose, or if their institution also happens to be an In Common member. In Common is a federation that is primarily joined by universities who are willing to create shared access to identification and authorization information so that a user at one institution can log in through their own institution and receive access to something at another institution, right? Because they know that they are trusted and have been given access to that thing, right? So if your institution is an In Common member and you log into Humanities Commons, you'll be able to use your university credentials and log in through a familiar interface because it will be your university's interface that you log in. It also means that if you have logged into your library in order to do some research, you'll be seamlessly logged in to Humanities Commons. Right? So, right, that's the user side. On our side, we're going to be using verified email addresses as the means of matching a member's login to any of the society memberships they have. Right? It's the cleanest bit of information that we can use to do this matching, though we're going to be working over the course of the next 6 months on creating some more sophisticated matching possibilities. And those society memberships will control the permissions that users have within the network, right? If your AJS membership is up to date, but your MLA membership is not up to date, you'll have access to and ability to contribute to stuff on AJS Commons, but not on MLA Commons until you update. And then, of course, there is the hub instance, which is Humanities Commons, to which everyone will have access. So what does all of that mean? First off, as I mentioned, any interested researcher or practitioner in the humanities will be able to create a free account on the Humanities Commons Hub, right, regardless of institutional affiliation or employment status or society memberships or any other determining factor. There will be some mild identity verification hoops to jump in the process of creating that account, mostly through email verification, but also in part to ensure, and this is again where In Common comes in, to ensure that anyone on the account who's creating an account, anyone on the network who's creating an account as Jane Smith, assistant professor of Slavic literature at Large State University, is actually who she says she is, right? And this again is one of the core principles behind the In Common Federation. It creates a fabric of trust among participating academic institutions and other scholarly collaborators, that we can believe that the person who is signing in as Jane Smith is actually Jane Smith. Now, in her case, creating an account on Humanities Commons will also give her access to MLA Commons and ACES Commons, because she is up to date with her membership in those organizations. She'll also be able to create a profile on the network that will appear in all 3 sites, and the academic interests that she lists there will link her to other members of the network that have those same interests. So these are all clicky fields that take you to lists of everyone who has similarly put in that field from our controlled vocabulary. This, we hope, will enable Jane and her colleagues to find potential collaborators and colleagues with whom they want to share work. Jane will also be able to deposit work in CORE and to share it with the groups to which she belongs. And that work will be linked from her profile. It's down below about. That stuff automatically gets populated to her profile. And she'll be able to track the impact that it has within the field by aggregating certain kinds of information about how the work is downloaded, cited, and used. She'll be able to start an individual blog or to participate in a group blog. She'll be able to contribute to an experimental publication that's housed anywhere within the 3 sites to which she has access. And this is just what she'll be able to do right away. We hope through integrations between Humanities Commons and other key scholarly data sources to be able to create an environment in the future, and this is going to take some research and development, but we do hope to get there, in which Jane might be able to leverage her university credentials to seamlessly use her library's research resources and then discuss those resources in Humanities Commons, right? To be able to move back and forth between those spaces seamlessly, or to reference those sources in a networked publication. And one of the things that's going to be happening in the next couple of years in our NEH-funded work on CORE is that she'll be able to deposit the work that she's doing in CORE, in our disciplinary repository, and have that work ingested automatically into her institutional repository, right? So that the work will exist in both places. It will not need to be deposited twice, and she can meet both institutional mandates if need be, and the desire to link up to her colleagues. So this is Jane, who has these multiple memberships, but it's not just fully employed folks or folks whose societies are already part of the network who will be able to benefit from it. So we've got John Doe here, who is a graduate student in history, also at Large State University, who will likewise be able to create an account on Humanities Commons, despite the fact that his scholarly society isn't yet participating in the Federation. He won't be able to participate in discussions on those sites where he's not a member, right? So he can't contribute to discussions on AJS Commons, but he can deposit and share work with the larger Humanities Commons community. And our hope is that his active participation and the active participation of his colleagues will draw his scholarly society to the Federation, right? To come to where their members already are, to draw them into more active participation in society business, and to support the interdisciplinary work that the members of those societies want to do in active ways. And this is where we get to the sustainability part of all of this, right? We're going to need those societies to support the network in order for it to succeed. Our goal is to reach full sustainability for humanities commons within 5 years, right, which is ambitious, I think, but doable. We want to shift over the course of that 5 years from grant-based support to a funding model that's based on reasonable annual fees that are paid into a common fund by the participating societies. And we expect, based on the experiences of projects like Archive, that we're going to have to be prepared to do some fundraising as well in order not just to support the existing infrastructure, but also the ongoing development, the maintenance, the technical support, and the community facilitation that this network is going to require. We're also in the process of developing a governance model that will permit both participating societies and the individual members of the larger network to have a voice in setting the network's future directions. And that, for me, is the most crucial aspect of the openness of Humanities Commons, right? It's not just that anyone can create an account free of charge, though I think that's extremely important. And it's not just that the broader public will be able to access the material that's shared there, also, though, clearly important, but instead that the network is and will remain not-for-profit, right? That it will be sustained and governed by scholars like you, as PBS is fond of saying. In order for this to succeed, though, we're going to need scholars to encourage their societies to participate in this federation, and then to support those societies that are doing this work on your behalf. The development of truly open, mission-driven, scholarly communities like Humanities Commons are going to require that societies and scholars alike embrace a shift in what has been long understood as the locus of value in joining a scholarly society, right? That value has for a long time resided in the receipt of member-only materials, right? You join the society, you get your journal subscription. You join the society, you get a discounted registration at the convention, what have you. But in the age of scholarly networks like this, the primary value for membership may instead lie in the ability to participate in the community's conversations and processes. And that's what we want to encourage, is greater participation. It's the last major hurdle, I think, to genuine openness. Beyond open access, beyond sustainability, there is collective action. And one of the problems that we have noted in getting scholars to do something like leave SSRN or delete academia.edu is the same issue that's been faced unsuccessfully by all of those, and they have been legion, who have sought to develop open alternatives to Facebook. Right? These networks are successful precisely because that's where everybody is already. Right? That's the center of gravity of them, and it makes a dissatisfied community, even a really dissatisfied community, extremely hard to move. So I hope that you will help us in getting folks to make that move, right? You can visit hcommons.org now and sign up for more information there, and encourage your colleagues to do the same. We're going to be seeking applications for beta testers, opening up very soon, in fact, and we're going to start that testing in October, followed by a public launch, though it will be a public beta, in late November. So come get information from us about what it is that you'll be able to do. Come help us test, find all the bugs that will no doubt be there in October. Come use the repository to preserve and share your work, and then let your scholarly organizations know that they should join this federation as well. If they do, I hope that you will keep your membership in those organizations up to date, that you'll help support the not-for-profit organizations that provide the community-focused, sustainable research infrastructure that we believe can facilitate new kinds of open work by new kinds of open scholars. And that is that. Thank you very much.
All right, who's got questions for Kathleen?
I've got one that I'm hearing from the Twitterverse. The relationship of other commonses that are not necessarily professional organizations, will they have a relationship with this one potentially?
Potentially, yes. I mean, what I would love to do would be to create a membership model for the Federation that enables organizations of a whole host of different kinds that have commonses that want to use this same federated identity management system to benefit from the linkages of scholars already there. So among them, I could imagine there is in New York a commons that was stood up by a cluster of scholars. That's the NYCDH Commons, right? And I would love to connect that into this system and have folks with NYCDH accounts seamlessly doing their work with their scholarly societies as well. Chris.
This is a great project. I'm really excited about it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see individual web spaces. So your own individual blog space, your own individual. We've been talking a lot here at Michigan State about a domain of one's own and empowering graduate students particularly, but our faculty also to create their own spaces online that would be their kind of canonical professional place where they would also share their materials in an open access way. Obviously, this provides all kinds of archiving capabilities and things that we don't have when we're just hosting our own WordPress site or something like that.
Right.
But how do you see the interface between, the time and energy we spend cultivating our online scholarly presence through those individual sites,
Right.
and the power of having a domain of your own that is your own, that you know will not go away until so long as you're around to sustain it, and the more common endeavor that you're envisioning here. I'm interested in the kind of interplay between these two.
Right. I think it's a really important question, and something that we need to spend some time thinking about is the relationship between the importance of owning your material as an individual scholar and ensuring that you have that domain, you have control of the stuff that you're depositing, and the importance at the same time of ensuring that your stuff is in the space where the people you want to find it are going to find it, right? This is something that we've tackled a bit with the relationship between disciplinary repositories and institutional repositories. Institutional repositories at a university by university basis have done phenomenal work in terms of giving scholars a place to preserve their scholarship, to make sure that it's available open access, to make sure that it's there, it's going to be there, and someone who cares about that stuff is going to be looking after it into the future. But the problem is that up until very recently, there hasn't been any way for anybody to know that your stuff is there, right? You put it into the institutional repository, and unless you've told me and I know to go look there for it, I'm not going to find it. And also, if I want to find all the stuff in my field, I've got to know how to navigate a billion different institutional repositories. So for a series of reasons, that among them, buy-in to institutional repositories has not been terrifically, it hasn't been astronomical, right? Disciplinary repositories have the benefit of, again, being that space where the colleagues that I'm actually hoping will see my stuff are going to be contributing stuff too. So my stuff is where their stuff is, and we know that this is a place where we can commonly go look for stuff. So preprint services like Archive have had that level of success that they have had because that's the space where that community is, right? What we're trying to do is create for the humanities that space where people are, and therefore your stuff should be too. But we also want to make sure that you feel like you have control of the stuff that you're putting there and that it is in the places where you want it to be, not just the places where we want it to be. So again, we're trying to build a mechanism that will permit stuff that we're depositing or that you are depositing on your behalf into core can be ingested by the appropriate institutional repositories in a seamless way. We also want to be able to, for those of you who already have a really solid archive of stuff that's in institutional repositories, to be able to deposit with one click and say, my stuff is over here. Please take and put into the disciplinary repository as well. This doesn't answer the individual website issue, but it does provide one potential way of thinking about that, right? You have a domain of your own and you have your WordPress blog. I have my WordPress blog that I have maintained for, more than 10 years now, and I haven't moved it to MLA Commons because people know its address. It is where it is. I like what I've got. But I think that we can provide ways for that work to be mirrored within MLA Commons in a way that then gets it into circulation within this network without me losing control of my space. Right? So I think the both and solution is the benefit here. I've had people ask me about, if you're putting stuff here and it automatically appears there, which is the version of record? And there's something, I understand why we are concerned about version of record. We always have been, right? Like the book is the version of record and the manuscript we know came before it, and so you should cite the book, not the thing that came before it. But when we're talking about digital files, they're all copies, right? There is no original. And so in some ways, having stuff in more places actually makes it more safe and makes it able to reach a much broader audience. I want to second some of the stuff that you said about altmetrics and the concerns about, my concern about a whole lot of the ways that we end up using metrics, even though I referred to them in this talk, that you'll be able to sort of measure downloads and the ways that your stuff gets cited and all of that, which is all really great. We tend to count things that can be counted, right? And we don't count stuff that you can't count. And that's a problem. We need to be thinking about more rich ways of understanding impact of scholarly work rather than just simply relying on metrics. But one of the things that having stuff in multiple places makes people nervous for is that if it's, do I then have to go through and find everywhere that it is and add up all of the altmetrics on all of those different URLs in order to be able to figure out what the real impact of this stuff is? Our hope is that at some point those things will be linked. They will have relationships across the internet, and therefore you will know that in all the many spaces where stuff has been placed, it has had this collective level of impact.
No, touching on that sort of thing about, say, researcher web pages at specific institutions. We try to link researchers to some sort of stable web identifier for them, and we use ORCID. I don't know if that relates with what you're doing, but we try not to do it with a university web page because, especially with the fact that so many people are so nomadic,
right?
Their affiliations are changing, especially sort of short-term people. So what I like about, what I think is so valuable what you're doing is that one can cultivate a stable internet presence, a stable web presence, and have a pointer that can be stable. So do you have stable URIs for people?
Yes.
Excellent. Because then that is such an important need for so many people in the scholarly community.
Exactly. It's another reason why institutional repositories haven't had the quite the success that one would hope for them, is that by and large scholars don't really identify with their institutions in the same way that they identify with their fields, right? Because people are so nomadic, because you start out as a grad student, you go here, you end up in multiple jobs and have multiple relationships with multiple institutions, and the people that you're trying to reach aren't at those institutions. They're out in the field at other institutions. Right. And so thinking about ways to create that stable identity that you can continue to build on throughout a career, I think is crucial.
I was wondering if you could speak to the commons within sort of the larger publishing world, particularly for repository of people's manuscripts or final products. So I know a lot of our member organizations derive a fair bit of funding from partnerships with publishers, and that puts in a lot of revenue. And so I guess I was wondering, does the MLA have similar partnerships, or because it's so large, is it able to do some of these things that maybe the smaller disciplinary groups aren't? It's sort of how those prioritize.
Yeah, it's a huge question, and it is one of the things that is a benefit of being as large as we are, right? We have had the ability to work on a project like this precisely because we're so big. And we're able to do a lot of development that the smaller societies just simply can't. They don't have the personnel, they don't have the resources, they don't have the funding. But we're hoping to be able to support some of those scholarly societies in adopting new models that might help them think about what their relationship to new forms of scholarly communication might be, right? We're not making an argument with the Commons that these societies should necessarily change the structure of how they're publishing their journals, or that they need to rethink their partnerships with commercial publishers or anything like that. That is entirely in those societies' domain and decisions that they can make. But what we want to provide is a space where the members of those societies can reach one another more openly in a more dynamic way that might provide new alternatives, right? For not just creating a journal article and circulating that, but creating new kinds of projects of the sort that you guys are working on, right? That can't be contained in those conventional publishing formats in the first place, right? So I think that there's a push on our part to say that opening up conventional publishing is a great goal, but it's not the only goal. And in fact, we really hope that we can take a step beyond that and that we can help other smaller societies do so in the same way, right? So that again, the goal, the concerns about the financial sustainability of scholarly societies based on the revenue derived from publishing the journal is able to open up a bit and say, well, actually, there's also this membership piece. And one of the key things that draws people into membership in our society is our ability to provide this space for them to participate in conversations.
Can I just tap into that funding side of it, because now I'll put my Dean of the College of Arts and Letters hat on. I mean, I think that's another source of funding in this sense, namely humanities colleges, liberal arts colleges, where there is an interest in ensuring that the faculty in those colleges have an incentive for making their work published and having it read.
Yes.
So that, and some units pay for pay for the memberships of their faculty. Others don't. There's all kinds of policies associated with this. It strikes me that one of the things one might put in place is, okay, if your society is a member of Humanities Commons, then maybe the institution would pay for the membership fee for you.
That would be fabulous. I would love to talk with you more about that possibility. I think that it's exactly the kinds of partnerships that we're really hoping to foster, to bring the entire scholarly community together in supporting a more sustainable model for ways that scholars are doing the work that they need to do, right? That's not just relying on one provider to continue supporting a platform that may get sold. Ethan.
How is your, sort of going back to the identity management, disambiguation stuff, how is the model, the framework that you guys are developing, going to interact with other services that provide that disambiguation, specifically?
Right. So we, right now, if you go to MLA Commons and look at a profile there, many of our members have added their ORCID numbers to their profiles, but they're really just hanging out there as a link to their ORCID profile. If I can get back to this, what you can't read here is that this says ORCID. And so it is another source of information that we are going to be tapping into to allow a member who wants to pull their ORCID data into their profile to do so. It's not going to be required, but we do think that this is an important linkage. ORCID has been in this kind of ambiguous state of late about whether they want to be used as an authentication service or not. So we're waiting for them to resolve on that position before we decide whether you can log into Humanities Commons using your ORCID credentials or not. But we definitely want to provide that connection because we think it's going to be extremely useful to building that profile, to be able to say, yes, I want this information from this service where it has been gathered from other information services to appear.
Anyone else have any other questions? All right, join me in thank you for All right, so we will break for lunch. Today is the campus archaeology tour. See how I got that straight this time? It is today, right?
Yes.
So what we'll do is we'll reconvene at 1:15.